Good morning, everyone. This is Andrea Copping with Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. I want to welcome you to this webinar today. This webinar is sponsored by Annex 4. Annex 4 is an international initiative of the Ocean Energy Systems Group, that is an international group of nations who are interested in the development of wave and tidal energy. As a part of this, could you go to the next slide? Thank you. We have currently 12 nations involved in the Annex 4 process, and this is a list of the nations and the representatives of those nations. So if you are among these nations, or even if you're not, we're very interested in dialogue and information about international sites, wave, tidal, and other ocean energy. So feel free to contact them, us here at PNNL, or to go on tethys.pnnl.gov to get further information. I'd like to turn the webinar over to Luke Hanna of PNNL to moderate.
Thank you, Andrea, and good morning to everybody. I will be the moderator today for today's webinar. As Tegan mentioned, please type all the questions into the webinar service, and then we will be fielding the questions after each participant. So the presenters today are Graham Dayborn, Richard Carson, and Anna Redden, all from Acadia University, and Greg Strauss from Fundy Tidal Incorporated. The first presenter today will be Graham Dayborn. Graham is a professor of emeritus at Acadia University, where he taught biology up to 2014. He is the founding director at the Acadia Center for Estuarine Research, and his current research interests focus on the environmental implications of generating renewable energy from marine environment with a specific focus on the Bay of Fundy. He's a member of the board of the Ocean Renewable Energy Group and volunteers on the Research Advisory Committee at the Tidal Area Subcommittee for the Offshore Energy Environmental Research Association. And I'd just like to also mention, I forgot to mention this earlier, but as you can tell by the title of today's webinar, it's going to focus highly on the tidal energy research efforts around the Bay of Fundy. As many of you know, due to its geographic location and overall shape of its basin, the Bay of Fundy is home to the largest tidal ranges in the world, which can be over 60 meters. Due to this tidal range and enormous amount of water that moves through this bay, there are exceptional tidal energy resources. So we are joined today by four scientists to focus the research on better understanding the tidal energy resource and potential in the Bay of Fundy and how tidal energy developments there may affect the surrounding marine environment and challenges. And I'd like to also add that this is a nice precursor to the upcoming ICOE conference being held in Halifax at the end of this month. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to Graham.
Okay, thanks very much. Well, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, or wherever you are around the world. The issue of tidal power has been a significant interest for us in the Bay of Fundy for a very long period of time. My role, to start with, is to just very briefly review that history to give you some sense of what we have learned out of almost, 100 years of investigation, and to then pass on to an analysis of presentation of what's going on at the present time. It's an exciting period for us, but as I say, this is not new. So firstly, what you should see on the slide now is a timeline. The very first proposal for tidal power was developed in 1912. That is, tidal power to generate electricity. We've had more than 200 years worth of mechanical use of the tides to generate mechanical power. But electricity became the interest in the 20th century. And Turnbull developed in 1912 a proposal for building dams in the outer part of the Bay of Fundy. And over the ensuing 100 years or so, we've had a whole series of different proposals. The slide will show you a number of those are written in blue, and these are all proposals that involved a tidal range approach, capturing the potential energy of water stored behind a barrage. But there is another approach, and that was initiated in 1915 by Carson to use the current velocity in the outer part of the bay, and that is the focus that we have at the present time. So the two yellow periods there refer to tidal stream approaches to energy generation. Underneath that time frame, there are several boxes which describe the fact that with the proposals for tidal power development, the engineering proposals, a series of multidisciplinary integrated research programs were initiated. The first one being in the 1930s, which ran through until the early part of the 1950s, to look at the implications of building barrage-type proposals in the Passamaquoddy area in the outer part of the bay. I'll show a map of these locations shortly. In the 1970s, we moved to the upper part of the bay, and that's where a good deal of the interest ensued for the next 20 years. And in order to understand the environmental implications in the upper part of the bay, the scientific community and the government communities together formed a group called the Fundy Environmental Studies Committee, which operated to try and convey to conduct research that was really well integrated and comprehensive. That committee came to an end in 1984 when interest in tidal power had declined once again, although at that stage we had developed a pilot demonstration plant at Annapolis Royal, which is shown there in the black. The tidal generating station in Annapolis has been operated ever since, effectively generating up to 20 megawatts of power, and has provided a very good platform for examination of a variety of environmental implications, particularly fish passage questions, water exchange questions, shoreline erosion, and so on. The next slide does not come out all that well, but it'll give you a sense for the Bay of Fundy for the period from 1960s through to the 80s. There were more than 30 different locations initially examined for potential development for tidal power. Most of these, as you will see, were in the upper part of the Bay of Fundy, the area known as Myers Basin, Shepherdie Bay, Cumberland Basin, and Chignecto Bay. But three of those proved to be, at least from a cost-benefit point of view, the ones that were most likely to take place. And these were examined in great detail during the period 1976 to 1984. I'll come back to what we learned from that a little bit later. Just to give you a larger scale picture, this is a map of the Gulf of Maine and Bay of Fundy system. The earlier proposals were in the outer part of the bay in Passamaquoddy Bay. Then in the 60s and 70s, we moved to the upper part of the bay, particularly to three locations indicated by the red barriers there. And then at the same time, in 1984, we saw the establishment in an existing causeway of a 20 megawatt plant, which is the Annapolis tidal generating station. A closer look at the area in the upper part of the bay would be useful just from the point of view of orienting people. The Annapolis Tidal Power Station is shown by the red star towards the bottom left-hand side of the map. The area that is currently under intense exploration and development that Anna will talk about shortly is in the Minas Passage, shown here. It's the entrance to Minas Basin on the right. And a particularly interesting point right at the edge of the entrance to that passage is a region known as Cape Split, which has been for a long time seen by people as a very likely place for the development of tidal energy. It's an extremely good location with very, very high velocities passing through. This photograph shows you the edge of Cape Split, and to give a sense of just how prescient Clarkson in 1915 was. His concept was to develop a tidal power station based upon current velocity that would pump seawater up to the top of the ridge on the right-hand side and then run that through a traditional electricity generating turbine, and so deal with the timing problem, the retiming of the energy. And the estimate was that this would have produced a fairly steady generation of electricity of something like 10 megawatts. He couldn't get $2.5 million in order to get that underway in 1915, so it never took place. Now we still have, I have indicated that the shift in interest is from tidal range proposals to tidal stream proposals, but there are still two tidal range concepts being considered. One is under early development in Cobscook Bay in Maine. It's the Kennewick tidal power plant. The plan is to build a new 500-meter long barrage across the entrance to the river and generate 21 megawatts there. A second one that is less well developed from the point of view of proposals. It's not been registered as a proposal yet, but some details have been made available. It's really at the concept stage. It's a much larger embayment at just near Cape Split, just south of the Midas Passage and Channel, for a 10-kilometer barrage to enclose perhaps as much as 39 square kilometers and generate 1,100 megawatts. That, as I say, has not yet been registered formally, so no further, examination of its implications will in fact take place once that registration occurs. So very briefly, what have we learned from particularly the last 40 years or so of research? In the first instance, because we were dealing with barrages, there were particular concerns about the impacts on tidal range. Some of the proposals that were examined in the upper part of the bay, it would appear from modeling, would have quite an effect on tidal range, not only in the Bay of Fundy, but further out in through the Gulf of Maine. This becomes a major issue because of the resonance relationships of the bay. Shortening the bay by building a barrage would tend to tune it even more effectively to the Atlantic tide and cause, in general, an increase in the tidal range. That may be a fairly modest increase, but with a lot of communities existing at the high water mark already, a significant and permanent increase in tidal range could be a significant concern. Again, we're talking about barrage studies. Major effort was involved in trying to assess the effects on fish. The Bay of Fundy has more than 100 species of fish known from, more than 40 of which migrate to the bay either to spawn in the tributary rivers or to feed there. So we have a significant component of species that are moving in from outside. There are also, of course, resident species. And using the tidal power station at Annapolis, the fish studies have looked at the potential mortalities of fish through the turbine. We've looked extensively at sediments. The upper part of the Bay of Fundy is an extremely muddy environment, and therefore trying to understand what would happen to those sediments has been a significant interest. We've naturally been concerned about the effects on benthic animals, and particularly in the upper part of the bay where the sediments are a critical determinant of the benthic community, and that benthic community is important for many migratory species. We looked at the effects of birds. These appear to be relatively minor, although diving birds could potentially be impacted by directly by turbines. It's more likely that the effect would be indirect by affecting their food supplies in one way or another. We've examined the effects on primary production, particularly associated with vertical mixing and the return of nutrients to the surface. Again, something which is rather important in certain locations, but even with large barrages, the effects are likely to be somewhat modest. And we've been concerned about the effects on mammals. The Annapolis tidal station has had 2 incidents over the last 30 years in which mammals have passed above the tidal power station, but in both cases those animals managed to exit through an existing fishway, and so we have no further knowledge of direct impact on mammals. It still remains a matter of concern. And the last thing that we've learned is really perhaps one of the most important, and that is the fact that because of the migratory species involved, the Bay of Fundy is extremely well connected to a very large part of the globe. The next slide attempts to show that case that through the movements of fish, birds, and mammals, the Bay of Fundy, which is shown by the red star there, in fact is linked to the Arctic, to the near Antarctic, the whole of the North and South Atlantic, Europe, North America, South America, and West Africa. So everything that we do has to be seen in relation to the concerns about the effects on migratory species. We've now shifted to tidal stream proposals, and the map up on the right-hand side indicates areas where there is active research at the present time examining the potential for tidal energy development. Minas Passage is indicated by the large star here, where the Fundy Ocean Research Center for Energy, or FORCE, has its major test site. And the other test sites out in the outer part of the Bay of Fundy, in Coxcoot Bay, and in various passages along the Nova Scotia shore, are currently under development and testing. And finally, as we have done in previous iterations of the tidal power story here, we felt the need to create a comprehensive and integrated group to make sure that the research that we do is relevant, focused, integrated, and collaborative. And that is the purpose of the Fundy Energy Research Network, which was conceived much like the previous networks of decades ago, which links together anybody who is interested in the tidal power issue within the Bay of Fundy. And those who are not members who are listening to this, you're very welcome to join. Thank you. That's the end of my presentation.
Great, thank you, Graham. That was excellent. We have not received any questions, but considering the time, I think we may just move on with Anna unless someone has a burning question that they'd like to type in at this moment. Okay. So Anna is a marine ecologist and associate professor in biology at Acadia University. She's the director of the Acadia Center for Estuarine Research and the Acadia Tidal Energy Institute. Anna is also the founding director of the board of the Fundy Ocean Research Center for Energy, or FORCE, and serves on committees of the Offshore Energy Research Association of Nova Scotia. Anna's research interests include the acoustic detection of marine mammals activities and the tracking of coastal fish and lobster in the Minas Passage. Anna is also the co-founder and co-chair of the Fundy Energy Research Network, or FERN. With that, Anna?
Thank you very much, Luke, and welcome everybody to our webinar. I'm going to, as Graham said, I'm going to be focusing on the FORCE test site. In particular, our attempts to do research to sense marine biota, and here we go. For those who are not familiar with the FORCE test site, it's located here in the Minas Passage of the Bay of Fundy. happens to be the area with the highest power density in the Bay of Fundy, and one of the reasons why the Fundy Ocean Research Center for Energy was selected this site. In addition to high power density, this site is also scoured. This is a rock platform that's running through the forest test facility here. So it features sort of scoured bedrock, boulder, cobble, and some gravel in this area. It's also in close proximity to a transmission line, and so these are among various factors that determine the location of forest. You can see down here what the substrate looks like in terms of the surveys that were done by Envirosphere in the early days. So very low biodiversity. Some extra work we've been really focused on the sponge being sort of the dominant taxa in this particular area. And you can see yellow encrusting sponge in the lower right area. So the fourth test area here in this rectangle shows 4 birth areas, 4 birth sites, 200 meters in diameter, A, B, C, and D. The red lines indicate the cable routes, and as of yesterday, 3 of the 4 electrical cables were laid. So a very big couple of weeks for forest. The 4th cable is likely to be installed later this week. Running along the top is a blue line. That's a data cable for attachment to a sensor platform. This particular test center has been set up to actually test large commercial scale devices. So we're looking at devices rated at 1 megawatt or more per installation, each powering somewhere in the range of 300 to 600 homes per unit, depending on summer-winter conditions. And this is the lineup of technology providers here. Open Hydro, scheduled to go in next year. BlackRock soon after that. Monmouth Energy is with Seabed, Blue Water for this floating device here to better aid maintenance. And then Atlantis Resources partnered with Lockheed Martin for a device that looks similar to this. So what are the environmental implications of tidal energy development, particularly given that forest is located in a tidal race with up to 6 meters per second current speed in the surface waters? We've talked over the last few years about what the near field effects would be, what the far field effects would be, and Forest has an advisory committee that was set up in 2009, the Environmental Monitoring Advisory Committee, which annually reviews what's been happening on the monitoring scene at Forest and makes recommendations to Forest on how it should proceed. The highlights in any sort of advice that comes to Forest, not too surprising, is really an examination of the potential impacts on marine mammals and those on fish and lobsters. There's a lobster fishery in this area. With regards to fish, as Graham said, we have many different species using this area. Many are transboundary, moving up and down the eastern seaboard of the United States. Many are also threatened or endangered and use the passage. This area in here is a migration corridor, coming in here to feed in the summertime. You can see on this figure fish weir. These have been popular over a long period of time in the intertidal zone. Largely they're herring weirs, but also catch other fishes. So we focused, the last 3 years we were focused on research that looked at the acoustic detection of fishes of concern and also lobster. And the lineup on the left shows at the top Atlantic sturgeon, below that striped bass, then American eel, and at the bottom Atlantic salmon, the smolt stage. And of course on the top are lobsters. So we've been particularly interested in looking at the temporal and spatial patterns in the use of these species in the Monmouth Passage and also within the forest test area itself. And we've been monitoring these species using acoustic tags, Gumco. We've tagged nearly 300 fish and about 85 lobster over the last few years, and with varying sort of tag sizes. Been largely focused on the adults of these species, or the larger stages of these species, given that the battery life is longer for larger tags. And of course, these are just a breakdown of those. And you can see that 2 of these species are listed as threatened, and another 2 listed as locally endangered. And so in order to detect these tagged fish and lobster, we set up receiver lines using these acoustic receivers from Mentos. You can see east and west of the Force Test Center here, and also through the test center, spaced at about 300 to 400 meters between units, with the receivers located or housed within these torpedo-shaped units here that have buoys inside them, and they're tethered more to the bottom, 2 to 3 meters above the bottom, listening for up to a year at a time. And this is a collaboration with the Ocean Tracking Network, who provided some of the instrumentation for this, and this is also the Ocean Tracking Network's acoustic receiver line. One of the first things we need to do in looking at tracking fish with acoustic tags is to look at the efficiency of detection of those tags, and current speed is not a tag's best friend, or at least not ours anyway. And so what this top panel shows is the current speed in the Montes Passage here at one of our receiver locations, showing periods of flood here greater than 1 meter per second, and ebb also 1 meter per second. This zone in here, slack water plus or minus, or up to about 1 meter per second, is the time period in which we're most likely to have detections of these tags, the tag transmissions. And so we've determined from various tag studies that we can detect those tags about 40% of the time, and certainly not during peak flows. So that is a limitation on what we can detect. The top left figure actually shows the cumulative frequency of those detections, and you can see that almost 30% of the time our depth average current speeds are greater than 2 meters per second, which is a big problem area for detection of these tags. We also see from the lower left figure that receiver detection efficiency decreases as current speed increases. And we saw some interesting differences on the ebb and the flood tides, with the ebb tide giving us much greater detection efficiency on the flood, possibly due to turbulence being a greater factor on the flood tide. Now, this figure in the lower right-hand side shows the number of detections of striped bass during 2011 relative to a depth average current speed. And you can see clearly when current speed is low, we get the greatest detections, and that falls off. So if you were to look at this on its own, you might think, oh, well, the fish just aren't there during high speed. This is a great thing. It won't be any problem for turbines spinning around at those high speeds. Well, actually, we don't really know if they're there or not. What this really does is just reflect the efficiency of detection of those tag transmissions. This table just shows a summary of fish use of the Montes Passage, those 4 fish species that we used. The top 2 are primarily used in Montes Passage during migration, so in and out with very few multiple passes in and out. Atlantic sturgeon and striped bass actually are found over several months in the Montes Passage with some detections, multiple passes. Atlantic sturgeon, for the most part, Atlantic sturgeon are in the Montes Basin and use the Montes Passage largely for migratory purposes. Striped bass is another beast. We're finding striped bass within the Montes Passage and near the Force Test site nearly year-round, and clocking up to about 4 meters per travel rate. So multiple passes in and out are common, as you're going to see from some of my slides, and hovering at depths largely between 15 and 35 meters. This figure here shows I'm going to focus on striped bass a little bit because it's our species of most concern and for which we have quite a bit of data. What we see in this figure here, this is the north side of the passage, and this is the bottom side of the passage. So this is north to south receiver line. This shows the bathymetry here, the bottom profile. And these are the detections and the depths at which we have detections. So you can see that striped bass largely in the top 50 meters throughout the passage. And the bottom panel shows the number of detections that we had for those 2 to 3 years. And you see that most of the detections actually come from the middle or the mid-range of the Montes Passage itself. The forest test area would be located in the boat here in slightly shallower waters than what we see here. That's a good thing. In terms of where they are day and night and whether or not there's an effect of the tidal state, what we see here is vertical migration from about 35 meters during the day up to about 20 meters during the night. We thought there might be a difference on the ebb and flood tide, given that the detection efficiencies seem to be quite different, but we saw no difference in where they're located relative to tidal stage. What we do see, and what's interesting here, is that for individual fish, this is one here that's 69 centimeters, another one here, 66 centimeter bass. They're using this area as more than a migratory route, and we actually have some consecutive detections, remembering that we are only picking up about 40% of the detections, are showing a movement back and forth across these lines in this area. So we know they're frequenting the forest site and the potential at risk. This is the movement of one fish one day. This is the movement of another fish over 103 days. So it's not just alone happening. We can have a fish coming in and for several months utilizing. One thing that the tagging studies, they tell us about sort of broader scale movements, but they can't tell us whether or not these fish can avoid a turbine. So other sort of technology is going to be required for that. One of the most interesting findings that we've had is actually the detection of striped bass during winter. We didn't expect this. And about 35% of our acoustic tags that were still active, still had batteries that were active, were detected during the winter time. And this represents five individual striped bass that you can see here coded on this side. And this is from December to April axis. And you can see they're appearing throughout this time period, except in about this period here. And this is a time period in which there's a fair bit of ice floating around in the Miles Passage, and when the water temperatures are in the range of about 0 to 2 degrees C. And for this particular fish, you can see that these are abundant sort of plots, these bump plots here, that they're actually located throughout the Miles Passage. This is just a concentration of receivers that we have near the forest test site. So they're there, they're utilizing this area, and on more than 80% of our winter days, we had detections of striped bass. This is a nice little figure that Freya Kaiser, master student working on this project, put together, showing consecutive detections of fish over several days in March. And so this just gives you the impression that they are moving around in here and potentially at risk. We also looked at tracking lobsters. We tagged 85 lobsters, so you can see the tag on the carapace here, picked them up in this location here, dropped them off here, and we actually determined that a fair number of them actually did move across the Miles Passage as the fishers indicated that they did during their annual migration. So not all of our lobsters actually moved, and in the second year of tagging, very few of them did. We didn't tag until December, coming into winter, and we feel that if they haven't moved by October, November, there's a good chance they're going to overwinter in the Miles Basin area right in here. Some of our complementary studies on habitat mapping and fisher interviews suggest that this might be the case. We also did baseline studies on harbor porpoise. This is a collaborative project with the Sea Mammal Research Unit. We used hydrophones and sea pods here to detect harbor porpoise click trains at various sites within and outside the forest test area. And we saw seasonal peaks related to prey, and that's in particular herring within this area. But a lot of issues around detection that limited to ambient noise. Flood tide being a particular problem. It's much noisier than ebb tide. Spring tides being very problematic relative to neap tides. And we also had some side effects. One of our sites was located to Black Rock, a small island sort of protruding and very turbulent. Gave that site up. That site's located right about here in terms of a monitoring site. And also issues around pseudo noise or flow noise around the tips of sensors like this. Again, we used these subsurface buoys here, installed our hydrophones in those in more than 2 or 3 meters bottom. This is a set of figures here that you can find in the paper Jason Wood led and was published last year. And basically, I won't go through this, but basically shows the various variables that contribute most to the patterns that we're seeing, and it's the temporal or seasonal and tidal influences that most contribute to the patterns that we viewed there. More recently, we have been looking at hydrophone performance using a small sensor platform that we put down in June of this year for a month. And we housed within that the IC Listen high-frequency hydrophone here, and without a shroud, and with a shroud to see if we could look at some shrouding improvements in terms of the data that we collected and how we could process that. You can see also some C-plots here. We also have a couple of MCO receivers mounted to that as well. So some very nice data is coming off of that as a collaboration with Ocean Sonics, Force, Fisheries, NSERC, and Litex. Force also has its sensor platforms and has a small and large platform. These sensor platforms will be either cabled or non-cabled and include acoustic and optical sensors. There is a project called the Vectron Project, which is one of the major projects associated with Force's FAST platform, and it's focused all around measuring turbulence at specific water column heights, and that's being led by University. So what we really want to get out of the Force test area is some real-time data collection, and we want to be testing sensor compatibility with each other, but also the sorts of sensors that are going to be able to work within a high-flow regime like the Force test area for turbine applications and for environmental monitoring as well. And these sensor platforms represent great collaboration potential for anybody who's interested in getting involved. Some conclusions and next steps. As you will remember me saying, there's relatively poor detection efficiency at high current speeds for acoustic tracking technology, but there's still partial data sets that are available that reveal movement patterns that we just had no idea of before. So it's been very valuable information. We have determined that migratory species vary greatly in their use of tidal races, and in particular it appears that striped bass and at-risk population almost uses this Miles Passage as a bit of a playground. They're present near year-round, including during winter, and our concern is that if they're sluggish at temperatures below about 6 degrees C, they may have elevated risk of collision. So our next steps are to actually look to see if there are indications of some sluggishness. We're going to do some work on antifreeze proteins and look at modeling encounter and collision probabilities for the various species that we have data for. The FAST sensor platform is a great opportunity to house sensors that can detect marine animal movements in turbines. And I just want to make a plug here for a funding opportunity that's available now through the Offshore Energy Research Association and the UK Technology Strategy Board. They actually, and you can see the link at the bottom is for that opportunity. This is about advancing sensor technology for use in high-flow environments. So if you don't know about that one, please go to that and let others know that that's a great opportunity that's coming up this fall. And that's the end of my talk. These are the various acknowledgments that I have. I know I don't have everybody there, but as you can see, all this work actually requires the effort of a lot of different people and a lot of different funding agencies.
Great. Thank you, Anna. That was fantastic. We still have not gotten any other questions, so if you guys, if you have any questions, please feel free to type them in. I do have one question for you, Anna. I know you mentioned you worked with SMRU to detect harbor porpoise activities. Have you focused on any other marine mammals? And if so, what have you found there, or are the harbor porpoise really the primary marine mammal concern in the Minas Passage there?
Actually, that's a very good question. I forgot to mention that the harbor porpoise are the primary marine mammal utilized in the passage. There are a few white-sided dolphins, but we have not picked them up with our sea pods. And it's occasionally we have a few whales coming into the area, but they don't tend to come up that far. And the other thing to mention about harbor porpoise is the densities, or what appear to be the densities for harbor porpoise based on our present data, is much lower than we would find at most other tidal sites, where these sort of studies have been conducted.
Great, thank you. We just received one other question. Bass usually hang out in whitewater and waves in environments with high currents. Do you really think there is a risk of collision with turbines rotating at 20 RPMs?
Bass, I had no idea.
Bass.
Oh,
bass. I'm sorry, bass.
Striped bass.
Not bass.
Do I think there's a risk? I don't know. I don't think we can rule it out. They like moving in fast water. They're fast swimming fish. We have them clock traveling at 4 meters per second. It's very, very fast. I'm hoping that they can take a big structure like that, but peak flows here are quite extreme, so we really don't know, and we need to find other ways to address that question.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you, Anna. Okay, and so I guess we'll move on to our next presenter if there's no other questions. So our next presenter is Richard Carson. Richard is a professor in the Department of Mathematics and Statistics at Acadia University. His research interests focus on oceanography, specifically the development of mathematical models of ocean circulation through the combination of ocean observations, such as satellite data and shipborne measurements, and historical hydrography, and numerical simulations, such as idealized models and full general circulation models. And so with that, Richard?
Okay, hello everybody. Sorry, a little technical difficulty there getting my presentation up. I'm going to talk very quickly about the hydrodynamics of the Bay of Fundy, so going back a little bit. Just a few details, and I'll try to finish this quickly so Greg can talk more about our project. Just on the slide, the first slide here, I just point out this is the picture. Graham showed a picture of the tip of Cape Split at low tide. This is the same area as the tide is flooding in, showing you the strong currents that do come in over this area as during the flood tide. It's a nice visit if you have an opportunity. This is just a highlight about the tidal range. We've already had this mentioned. We have the largest tidal range in the world. The system is an M2 dominated system, so we see and it has a frequency of about 13 hours, so very close to the M2 frequency. So we get this resonant high tides up to about 17 meters, and this large amount of water up to about 160 billion tons of water entering the base of the Bay of Fundy, the south end of the Bay of Fundy, down here. Just to talk about the locations that we're looking at, this is a map we did on looking at the potential installed capacity of the various passages. The main passages we've been talking about, minus channel, minus passage so far, is the large resource that we're looking at with possibly a reasonable installed capacity of 1,400 megawatts. And that would be a capacity that would have a small impact on the flow through the passage. We've limited the impact to being less than a 5% change in the flow and in the surrounding tides. And then later on in the presentation, I'll talk about the Digby Neck areas, the three passages there, Digby Gut, Petite Passage, and Grand Passage, and Greg will be spending more time on those. They're much smaller in size, community-scale tidal power projects. So Minus Passage we've been talking about before. It's a 5-kilometer wide passage, 15 kilometers long. As mentioned, the water speeds get up above 5 meters a second. If you look at the entire Minus channel, again, the water, deep water is in Minus Passage, so the colors here going from 0 to 150 meters deep, showing a very deep central passage in Minus Passage, and we'll see this on a cross-section in a second, and then shallower along the north and south shores. The tide is asymmetric, as Anna mentioned. Here's a snapshot of flood tides coming in with the water speeds getting consistently above 5 and 5.5 meters a second. It comes around the tape of Cape Split. So down here you see Cape Split, the flood coming around it. And this means that it really only occupies the flood tide sort of about 2/3 of the passage. Actually, along Cape Split there in blue, there's recirculating water coming back against the flood tide. So very strong currents, but just in the two-thirds of the northern part of the passage. If you look at a cross-section of that, so this is with depth and across the channel, this is on your left there, that's Cape Split. Going across to your right is the northern shore of Parsboro side, and the fourth site would be located off to the northern shore there. And we see that the strong flow has been shifted to the northern part of the channel. It does extend through most of the water column, stronger at the surface, but through most of the water column. And I should say these are most of the results I'm showing here are based on model results, so take it understanding that. We had validated these models with ADCP and other measurements, but they are model results. That's the flood tide. On the ebb tide, the picture we get of the currents, and they look weak here, but these are our 3 meters a second currents, and they're spread out more or less evenly from the south end of the channel to the north end of the channel, with stronger flows off the tip of Cape Split there. And a cross-section then shows that these flows are distributed. The strongest flow is still in the center part of the deeper part of the channel, but not as concentrated on the northern shore as we see flood tide. And this is going to create issues with the observations that Anna was taking. You're going to get different ability to detect marine species on the flood as compared to the ebb, and it does change with different locations. And the last thing I'd say about this, a couple last things, on slack tide, especially the slack tide between as the flood turns to ebb, so as after high tide, we actually still see strong currents throughout the passage. This is a snapshot just as at the end of high tide. And we see a residue, at least in our models, and we see evidence of this in the observations as well, of large-scale eddies and waves creating strong flows during this slack tide. So it becomes very difficult to do any work in the passage during this slack tide. On the other hand, the slack tide after low tide is actually a very calm slack tide, still not lasting particularly long, but we see no currents during that slack tide. And this is important for the fourth site because that tip of strong flow here coming around out of West Bay comes right across the fourth site and creates currents in odd directions during this supposed slack tide. And the last thing I'll say about Nine's Passage, Anna mentioned this a bit, is that there is strong turbulence in the region. This is one photo from a study that is being done at UNB as part of our research projects. It's showing the turbulence that comes off the shelf area around forest region. So the area in white there is the shelf region. Its water depth of about 30 meters, and the area in blue and red is a water depth of about 50 meters. And as the ebb tide comes across this, it creates these turbulent wakes as the water comes down off that shelf. And we've seen this again in ADCP observations. And of course, this turbulence is not uniform over the whole passage. So again, in terms of doing detection or any type of study, you could be in a region of turbulence, not in a region of turbulence, and it's going to change any acoustic detections that you're going to do for sure. Okay, I wanted to quickly go down to Dickey Neck areas, talk about the 3 passages down there. These are ComFit community feed-in areas where there has been projects of relatively small scales, 0.5 megawatt to 2 megawatt projects that are under development, and so we've been studying these areas, and Greg will tell you a lot more about this. The first passage is Digby Gut. It's a relatively deep passage, getting down to 80 to 100 meters deep. It has a small shelf. If you go look just under that red line that is showing you the 850 meters, there's a shelf area coming from the shore on the left. That's the area most focused for the initial deployment of turbines. It's a passage that connects the Bay of Fundy. If you look at the previous slide, actually a big part about this is it has a similar tidal dynamics to Midas Passage in that it connects a basin, Annapolis Basin in this case, to the main Bay of Fundy. So it plays a similar role. The currents we've looked at them, measured. This is one way of measuring the currents that Greg has been using in terms of putting drifters in there. We see a fairly strong currents reaching over 3 meters a second, both on the flood. This is the flood tide. This is the flood tide from our models, also showing these strong currents. Generally focused in the center part of the passage, with large speeds over that shelf, and then the large speeds on the flood tide extending south of that shelf. If we look at the ebb tide, we get sort of the opposite picture, similar strong currents in the center of the passage, but now they are still strong over that shelf, but extending northwards. So this shelf area, which you can kind of see in the sort of horseshoe shape in this reddy-orange area, is the area of interest because it has both strong flows on the flood and the ebb. Next passage to look at quickly is the Teak Passage. It's a thinner passage, about the same length. It now just is a passage between the Bay of Fundy and large St. Mary's Bay. So it doesn't connect a small basin. It doesn't really affect the tides. It doesn't play an important role in the tidal range in the area. It has very strong currents. Here again is a drifter picture of the currents reaching over 4.5 meters a second. Strong currents throughout the passage, but especially at the sort of choke point at the center of the passage. This is probably the initial area of interest. It has the strongest currents, and we can see these strong currents. That quickly on both the flood tide and the ebb tide, very similarly strong currents, again with a bit of an asymmetry between strong currents in the center for both tides. The currents tend to be stronger in the south on the ebb and stronger in the north on the flood. And the last passage I'll talk about quickly is the one we've probably done the most work on, and it's Grand Passage. It's a 700-meter wide passage we see here, but it extends wider. It has a very changing both bathymetry, coasts all along the passage. It again is connecting the Bay of Fundy to St. Mary's Bay. The water speeds are slightly slower than Teak Passage, going up to about 3 meters a second, maybe 3.5 meters a second. And here's some drifts that Greg has done on both the ebb and the flood. The one thing that we do see in this passage, much more than the other passages, Teak Passage and Digby Gut, is we have a lot of interesting bathymetric features here. We can see on the ebb drifters here that the drifters pass around this small island, Peters Island, and they create very interesting flow as the flow goes around this island. We have, I think I have on the next picture, I'll show a little more. This is a picture, I've done two pictures here to emphasize a couple of things. The one on your left is a speed picture during the flood tide, the tide going north here. What we see is areas, hot areas, the orange-red areas, a strong flow. Most of these areas are associated with some sort of shallow bathymetric feature as the water speeds up over a shallow feature. And then we see around Peters Island, the flow is actually fairly complex. If I showed an animation of this, you'd see waves and eddies coming off Peters Island, creating a very turbulent regime to the west of Peters Island, but not so turbulent to the east where it's a larger passage. The east of Peters Island may be a good site for tidal development. The picture on the right there is just showing the tidal elevation at this time, and I just put this up to emphasize that all these strong flows are driven by these change in depths. So during the flood tide here, the tide in St. Mary's Bay is approximately 25 centimeters, 30 centimeters higher than the tide in the Bay of Fundy, and that's what's driving all our flow through this passage. And you can see the tide changes abruptly, fairly abruptly, in the southern end of the passage, the water being sort of held back by Peters Island and the shallow shelves that are there, and then flooding through those passages, creating the strong currents. And on the ebb tide, this picture is reversed. The water is now high in the Bay of Fundy and low in St. Mary's Bay, and this pushes the water southward through the passage, and again we see various hot spots. This one on the top, I think we'll see in Greg's slide, this is the site we're looking at for tidal development now because it has a mixture of features, strong flow, nice depth, and things like that. In the middle, there was another site we were looking at tidal development. This hot spot in the middle is as the water comes over a very shallow shelf. And then again, down in the south, we would have a possibility right about where that number 20 is, another possibility of a site where we have strong flow. And now on the ebb tide, you see a series of eddies and waves producing very strong flow and turbulent flow south of these. So I'm going to stop there. I'm just going to show the companies and universities that have been involved in our research project looking at the Digby Neck passages. That's been extending work that we were doing in Minus Passage. But I think I'm going to leave it for Greg to tell you a lot more of the details of the work we've been doing there.
Okay, so the next presenter, as I mentioned, will be Greg Strauss. Greg is the Chief Technology Officer at Fundy Tidal, which focuses on small-scale tidal energy projects that involve community ownership and local benefits. Greg's research focuses and responsibilities include resource assessment and site characterization activities, evaluation of technologies for deployment at Fundy Tidal birth sites, Fundy Tidal's R&D projects, and the development of implementation and environmental effects monitoring plans. Greg worked with the Nova Scotia Power as an environmental specialist during the open hydro deployment in the Midas Passage and assisted them with environmental and performance monitoring. Greg is currently a member of the Fundy Energy Research Network Biological and Ecological Effects Subcommittee. Greg?
Thanks a lot for the introduction. Just before getting started, I just wanted to add that my background is environmental engineering and physical oceanography. I want to stress that I'm not a biologist, but did read the cetacean chapters in Moby Dick, which led to the title of my presentation, where the Leviathans live. Chloe Malinka is a biologist that's been working with us for a few years. She's formerly with Dalhousie University and now working as a research assistant with SMRU. She helped a lot with putting together this presentation, and her current focus with us is providing services for our marine life observation program. So we can go to the next slide. The objectives of the presentation today are to introduce Fundy Tidal on our sites, give a bit of an overview of some of the environmental work we've done to date, and outline some of the next steps and opportunities to collaborate. So as Richard mentioned, community is really large in our projects. Community ownership and control are fundamental to Fundy Tidal's project developments. Our projects are approved through the Nova Scotia Department of Energy CONFIT program, which we qualify for by being a CEDC and selling CEDA shares. I'm not going to get a lot into that right now, but there's a link there in my presentation for anybody that wants to look into it further. But we do have 82 shareholders, 10 of which are on the board of directors, including local business owners that are key to the supply chain for developing our projects. The CONFIT rate is $652 per megawatt hour, and that's for a 20-year power purchase agreement with Nova Scotia Power. The term small scale in small scale community feed-in tariff refers to a limit of the power output of individual turbines. We're not to exceed 500 kilowatts in a single turbine, but larger arrays are okay. All of our projects are distribution connected, so local power use limits our ability to put power to the grid. The existing cap is minimum annual load, so the least amount the community uses on an annual basis, which is likely to remain as our cap until we can demonstrate energy storage, and we're also working on demand-side management to change what that annual minimum load is. Overall, our goal as a company is to generate dividends for our community shareholders through sale of tidal energy to grid at the CONFIT rate, and also by providing technical services such as resource characterization and environmental monitoring and things like that we've been developing at our sites to other projects around Canada and potentially in other areas. The Venn diagram that I put up in the top right of this slide shows the connection between the community, site development, and the sea, which is really important throughout our work. The primary topics that come out in the confluence of these three things are fishing, navigation, and marine life at our sites. But there's also the unexpected, including what was called an Island Mania wrestling festival that happened at the islands this weekend. The photo on the bottom right is showing a little bit of Island Mania, at least warm up for it. And it covers all three areas, but due to time limitations, I'm gonna skip along and leave that for Q&A if anybody's interested. So we can go to the next one. So the three sites we're discussing, as Richard pointed out, are in southwest Nova Scotia: Digby Gut, Petit Passage, and Grand Passage. The plot on the right shows some representative depths for the area around Grand Passage and Petit Passage. The flood tide as it fills into the Bay of Fundy flows generally from the south to the northeast, going from deeper waters up over shallow shelves, which creates a nutrient-rich and really productive feeding ground. Grand Passage is, of our sites, located the closest to this feeding ground. So you'll see a little bit of that in the data that I'll show in coming slides. So you can go to the next one. Thank you. I'll move through these relatively quickly because Richard already showed them, but this is just a closer look at Grand Passage. The plot on the left is combined multibeam bathymetry and LiDAR. The multibeam came from a local fishing vessel, which we were really lucky to have access to, and also the Canadian Hydrographic Service. The LiDAR data is from Nova Scotia Community College. The flow data on the right, as Richard pointed out, are plots of surface flow from low-profile drifters. Here, for presentation purposes, we've just separated into flood and ebb. For site work, we tend to do time bins of an hour or less, so we can actually look at temporal variation of the flow speeds of the drifters as well. As Richard pointed out, Grand Passage has really complicated flow due to the shape of the passage. With Peters Island in the south entrance, there's a really large intertidal cove on the Freeport side, and Cow Ledge, which is a large intertidal shoal on the north entrance. So move to the next one. Petit Passage has the strongest flow of our three sites. These surface flow plots show asymmetry in large areas with flow speeds that exceed 4 meters per second. The fastest surface flow measurements that I collected in sort of the 2 days of data collection that this is showing was about 4.9 meters per second and occurred on the ebb tide. Next, please. Digby Gut has very deep areas, up to approximately 100 meters, but faster flows are over the shelf with depths up to about 30 meters. So that's sort of our focus area for tidal energy development. The channel scale flow is really asymmetrical, but it accelerates quickly over the shelf in both directions. Next, please. So moving on to turbines. The Digby Gut project we're currently developing with Ticardo, which is a turbine developer from the Netherlands. It's a 1.95 megawatt project that we intend to develop in 2 phases, with the first turbines going in next year in 2015. The preliminary design is looking like 12 to 16 turbines, depending on how we finalize the design in terms of the size of those turbines and what we, settle on for what the maximum flow speeds will be, at least predictive-wise anyway. And that'll be on 3 to 4 floating platforms that are being shown in a model from Dynamic Systems Analysis that's doing sort of the mooring load analysis for us. In the top picture there, Ticardo is the picture just below it to the right, the red and white 2x2 turbine. For Grand Passage, we have a memorandum of understanding with Clean Current, which is a technology developer from British Columbia, Canada. It's a 0.5 megawatt project, again, planning to develop it in 2 phases. The preliminary design for that one is 4 turbines, each, approximately 125 kilowatts to make up the total of 500. And that'll be deployed on either 1 or 2 platforms, depending on some of the mooring load and seabed type stuff we're looking at right now. Petit Passage, we have an MOU with Nutricity from Scotland. It's a 500 kilowatt project. Looking at doing this one in 1 phase, following the other projects likely. It's as with the other ones in the preliminary design, but it's most likely to be quite similar to the midwater column design that Nutricity has already developed and tested at the Annex site in Orkney. And the picture on the bottom right is that turbine actually just getting prepped to go in for a test that was sometime this spring. Luckily, when I was actually over at Orkney for meetings at ENIC, so I get to meet with Cameron and see that getting ready to go in the water. Overall, all of our projects are in the financing and preliminary design phase. So lots of work to be done over this winter and next year. Next slide, please. This year we opened up a field office in Freeport, which is located on the northeastern shore of Grand Passage. It's a really great spot and a beautiful place to work. The deck is an excellent position for marine life observation. It's really not surprising to observe humpbacks, minke whales, as well as harbor porpoise and seals from the picnic table. We've also seen a lot of other things, but those are the ones that, on a weekly basis, wouldn't be surprised to see. The office also provides power, shelter, and high-speed internet for locating cabled sensors, including this year we deployed a small-scale cabled observing system, as it's being called, which currently consists of a 500-meter armored cable to an ADCP bottom pod, which is measuring flow, waves, temperature, and pressure. We recently supported Dalhousie University in a proposal to add a CO2 sensor to that platform, which would be part of a Gulf of Maine ocean acidification monitoring program. This summer we also did a cabled passive acoustic monitoring test with Ocean Sonics, which is a Nova Scotian company that Anna mentioned, using the high-frequency IC Listen hydrophone. Also soon we're planning, hopefully before the winter, planning to install a webcam directed at the ADCP and turbine burst sites so we can get a look at some of the storm conditions, and hopefully a lot more coming soon. In addition to that, I wanted to point out that the whale tour boats offer great vessels of opportunity for testing equipment. here I've included a couple of sounds that were recorded when I was getting familiar to the with the icy listen hydrophone before the cable deployment. Whales definitely come into the area for feeding, not the type of singing and courtship type songs that you can hear in warmer waters during the winter. Let's try and play the first and see if it works. Yeah, that kind of worked a little bit. We'll try the second one. It's a little bit quieter, but if you can make it out, it definitely confirms that there's a lot of feeding, almost of a buffet style going on in the waters. Oh, that's too bad. It's too quiet. We'll just move on. So overall, our environmental monitoring program focuses on a look and listen approach. The picture on the right is the IC listen hydrophone in about 10 meters of water. So that's I took that snorkeling during our cabled deployment. And we also include visual sightings from our marine observers. Overall, for 2014, our focus was really baseline environmental monitoring, including marine life and noise. While doing so, we were also testing methods and sensors for use around the turbines in 2015-2016. And I'd just like to say our objective is to help out with all the other, really interesting research that's going on around the world right now to develop real-time marine life monitoring system using acoustics, video, and marine observers to assess potential near and midfield interactions between turbines and marine life. So the first look that I'm going to highlight includes local eyes on the water. We got funding through the Offshore Energy Research Association to do the Bay of Fundy Marine Life Observation Program. It includes public, citizen scientists, local whale tour operators, and dedicated trained observers, which equal part-time local jobs, which is a great community benefit. Those trained observers received a 2-day marine observer training course from Dr. Moira Brown, who works with the New England Aquarium as well as Canadian Whale Institute. So she did the whale ID type stuff, and I trained people on the use of 2 smartphone applications to use for the actual data collection. The first one, and the smartphone applications were developed by a company called Conserve.io. Whale Alert is one that's used for opportunistic data, so primarily for public use. And then Spotter Pro is for effort-based surveys. Our trained observers used it, as well as whale tour operators. In addition to this, we also collected opportunistic data through social media. Quite often I'd be sitting in my office and I'd see a Facebook post or something will pop up like that there was a whale or something like that in the passage. So we would then follow up on location and time and any photos if they weren't. We're going to be comparing, since we're including whale tour operators as well as dedicated observations in the passage, we're going to be comparing both data sets. For baseline conditions, we're looking at trying to answer questions like, do all the marine life species seen outside the passage also travel through the passages? What proportion of marine life in the vicinity also travel through the passages? And how do the species and number of marine life sightings recorded in the passages relate to things like sea state, tide stage, and other factors? As of October 19th, we've got about 250 hours of dedicated observation over 79 observation periods. So we're using sort of 3 to 4 hour observation periods for the dedicated observers. That sort of sometimes they get cut off due to fog or weather, things like that. Overall, they're representing about 9,500 individual marine mammals that have been sighted, and fish and birds. So 9,500 mammals, fish, and birds over the 3 passages in Outer Bay of Fundy. The breakdown of that is about 1,500 marine mammals over 8 species, which are listed here and shown in the image to the right, as well as 8 fish across 4 species. So porbeagle sharks, thresher sharks, basking sharks, within tuna. We know other types of sharks do exist in the area, but they haven't been sighted in our program. And lots of birds, about 8,000 individual birds across 48 species. The photo on the bottom left is a porbeagle shark that I observed during one of our drifter surveys in Steep Passage. It was swimming south against about an 8-knot flood tide, and it appeared to be gaining ground at about 2 to 3 knots. So that works out to somewhere around approximately 20 kilometers an hour through water it was swimming. Pretty cool sighting during work. So this slide is showing an example of marine mammal sighting rates. The plot compares marine life observation rates outside the passages to the observed in each of the passages. The y-axis has been effort corrected, and it gives the number of animals sighted per minute of observation effort. As expected, it shows Grand Passage to be a really busy area. The frequency of harbor porpoises sighted in Digby Gut was a bit of a surprise. We didn't know that area was used so heavily by harbor porpoise, but I guess it sort of makes sense with the sightings that they're seeing up further in the bay at Manus Passage at the force site. I just want to point out with the dolphins, it has really high rates, but those are associated with few events of large groups. We had events where we saw, at least what was estimated as over 100 dolphins in Great Passage at one time. These plots show the spatial distributions. The heat map on the left is for harbor porpoise, and it's consistent with the previous slide. It shows hotspots in Grand Passage and Digby Gut. It also shows the tracks of the whale tour observations, so you can kind of see where the data gaps are and where it's highlighting sightings, as well as the positions that we do our marine life observation from. And then the plot on the right shows locations of individual sightings, and these are calculated using the observer position from the iPad, which is used for data collection, and observer entry of bearing and range using a laser rangefinder, which is often just used for training your ranging ability. Sometimes you actually range off the actual animal, and marine binos for the bearing. The observation position is at the north end of the passage near Cow Ledge, so that sort of explains the cluster of animals being seen around there. You can see there's a lot of minke whale. And the right whale, which would have been out of, well, you probably would have been able to see it. Yeah, you would have been able to see it if you're looking for it from that distance, but it so happened that the one that's sort of on the southeast there was reported through Facebook and then confirmed. Thank you. Moving on, for looking underwater, we recently conducted a video survey to assess seabed composition in benthos. This survey was conducted with Dr. Nina Stark from Virginia Tech as part of developing techniques for initial geotechnical surveys using a lightweight dynamic penetrometer she developed called Blue Drop. So this also included gathering info for preliminary engineering design for our moorings and remaining anchors. In terms of benthic habitat, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans has requested images around turbines, foundation, anchors, and cables, including characterization of the habitats and the species they support, and they'd like to have it broken down by life stage and life process. It's a really recent survey, and a biologist hasn't reviewed the images yet, but image 11, which is at the north end of the passage, indicates a fairly productive habitat, and 9, which is where we're looking at putting a turbine, indicates mostly cobbles, and you can see the crab in the left of the image. Move to the next one. Thank you. Grand Passage was an example of, the previous one was a sort of an initial broad survey. This one is a more focused survey. We've also done a lot of video work to the north end of the passage, including doing video of the full cable routes, but we stayed away from it in this survey just because we didn't want to drop anything on our ADCP or our cable. But it's just giving an example of more focused surveys. This one was a balance of sort of academic interest that Nina had around sediment dynamics in the turbulent zones around Peters Island, and also in the large intertidal zone in Freeport Cove, while also getting some information to evaluate a potential turbine burst site. Overall, there's really highly varied seabed conditions in Grand Passage. At the turbine burst site that we're looking at, sort of the one in the middle there that I've highlighted, images 46 and 44, it was really rocky with a lot of cup attached. And also for looking, it can be done by drones now as well. And UAVs are starting to offer some cost-effective solutions for aerial surveys. We're currently using UAVs to survey the intertidal zone, and there's also potential to use them for marine life observation. For a large intertidal zone like Cow Ledge, which we pointed out before at the north entrance of Grand Passage, having these intertidal zone elevations are really important for resolving flow features in numerical models, such as what Dr. Carson uses. And the elevations are also really important for cable routing. And as demonstrated by researchers at SAMS, who we're collaborating with a little bit on this, the images can also be used to characterize intertidal zone benthos. The two images that I'm showing here, the digital elevation model and the ortho images, were generated in about a 20-minute survey at 115-meter altitude. There's a lot of image overlap. There's about 9 images overlapping at most of the places in these photos. And the resolution of that is approximately 3 centimeters per pixel. And we're currently working on improving that digital elevation model with some ground control points and comparing it to some of our LiDAR data where we have overlap. For LISTEN, we did an initial research project was conducted in Grand Passage back in 2012 between Ocean Sonics and Dalhousie University. This was really mostly Chloe's work. It was her undergraduate honors project when we started working with her. It focused on estimating acoustic detection ranges to evaluate the feasibility of passive acoustic monitoring for marine mammals. Harbor porpoise clicks were detected, but it had a common problem of flow noise that Anna had talked about, increasing with current speed and reducing the detection ranges. And this summer, we conducted a short-term test with a cabled IC listen high-frequency hydrophone. The plot on the right shows the deployment location in relation to the office. So the deployment location is the black square. It also shows the a potential turbine burst site, so it's relatively close to that, as well as the IC listen deployment location from 2012, which is in slightly stronger flow. We chose that location intentionally to go for a lower flow area this time, and haven't really put a lot of time into processing the data yet, but it did play real-time continuous sound in my office, some of which was concurrent with dedicated marine life observation periods. So we included noise characterization of the ferry as well as several local vessels, and one of the initial results is that the ferry is extremely loud. I usually end up having to turn down the hydrophone or turn it off when the ferry was doing crossings. The spectrogram that I'm showing here shows an example of the ferry crossing on the ebb tide. It starts off by idling its engines. They really rarely shut off in the passage, only sometimes at night. And then it revs up on the Freeport side and then pulls out into the flow and crosses over to Westport. So we're able to hear the ferry all the way across the passage. And also just from listening real time, the loudest ferry noises seem to occur actually when the ferry is coming back into Freeport against the tide and has to make high power adjustments. And we'll try this sound and just see if it works. It'll be of the ferry. Thank you. So that one works. Yeah, the ferry is extremely loud. So, that does give us some sense of baseline conditions in the passage and something to compare turbine noise to. The last thing I was going to talk about in terms of listening is it also includes discussions with locals. The fishing map that I'm showing on the right was put together by meeting door-to-door with local fishing captains. We discussed potential turbine locations, valued fishing areas, and navigation routes. The fishing captains each marked up a fresh chart showing where they set single traps and trawls, and with a separate color, they also marked up where they know others to fish. From the individual charts, we produced the combined map shown here. And overall, there's significant community support. It was really good meeting with them one-on-one, and it looked like there's minimal direct impact associated with the turbine burst sites. The primary concerns are with potential damage to the cable. They all seem quite willing to somewhat adjust where they put traps, let us run a cable through, but also told us how often they haul up the subsea cables of Nova Scotia Power that connect Briar Island to the grid. And so we're a little bit weary of that. And also there are other concerns around navigation, not so much with local vessels, but primarily with vessels from away that don't know the waters as well and might be coming through the passage in poor visibility and weather conditions. And overall, just for next steps, I'd like to say that we're looking to participate in collaborative work focused on near and midfield interactions between tidal turbines and marine life. The sites like Grand Passage and Petit Passage and Digby Gut as well are an excellent place to work. There's really high species diversity and abundance, so the probability of encounters is quite high, allowing study of reactions from many different species. We think it's an excellent test environment with a good range of flow speeds, diveable depths, good visibility, and shore infrastructure such as the office, and great community support as well. So we hope that small-scale projects such as ours can help answer some of the questions about potential environmental effects of tidal energy development, and really think that some of the uncertainty should be reduced before moving to larger developments. We've also got a quick list of just some of the work that we have planned here, but it's pretty consistent with things that other people are doing. So we're looking to collaborate and help out where we can. Thanks a lot.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Greg. We have a couple of questions, and so the first is actually for you, Greg. Where does the money ultimately come from to pay for the $652 per megawatt hour? Is it from public funding or investments by Nova Scotia Power?
So it kind of cut in on a muting thing when you're asking the question there. It asked about the money. We sell the power to grid at $652 per megawatt hour, and that rate, as with all the other feed-in tariffs in Nova Scotia, gets distributed amongst all the ratepayers. So nobody is buying power directly from us. People buy power from Nova Scotia Power, and our projects are so small, with a total capacity of about 3 megawatts, that it is really quite negligible to the ratepayers' monthly bill.
Great. Okay. The next question is for Richard. With the tide so symmetric in minus passage, what challenges does this present for siting turbines for effective energy capture while being sensitive to fish and marine mammal passage?
That's a good question. Near the port site is probably the northern shore is the best site for consistent power production because it sees the strong flood tide and the consistent ebb tide. The biggest and one of the advantages of doing that, and Anna would have to address where the species go, but any development will probably not move towards the deep central part of the channel because it's too deep. It's over 100 meters deep, which right now is beyond the capabilities of deployment for many types of turbines. So that will leave that open for marine life migration. I think the one bigger challenge that we will see if the technology developers can handle this is the asymmetry in the tides means that on the flood tide you have to deal with something like 5 meters a second, and then on the ebb tide you're dealing with a flow of 3 meters a second. For many devices, finding the optimal installed capacity and rated speed is very difficult between those two speeds. You've got to build a device that's sturdy enough to handle the strong flows, but you aren't going to have it rated at 5 meters a second, otherwise it'll be only at its capacity maybe 20% of the time. So there is some work to be done in finding the right type of turbine that will take advantage of a really strong flow and then a weaker flow on the ebb tide. So that's where some work has to be done.
Gotcha. Okay, great. Thank you. It looks like we are just about out of time. So I'd like to just close out today's webinar by thanking all of our presenters and all of you who are on the line as well. As I mentioned, this is was a regionally focused webinar, and it served as a precursor for the upcoming International Conference on Ocean Energy, which is being held in Halifax on November 4th, 5th, and 6th. If you want more information on that, you can just Google ICOE 2014. And I'd like to just also mention that a recording of this webinar along with the presentations will be posted on the TETIS site, and we recommend you all visiting this at tetis.cnr.gov. So with that, thank you all for joining us.